In a world where an heir was a woman's only worth, Lady Elara was judged a failure. Her husband, a lord whose pride was as cold as his heart, made her shame a public spectacle. Before his entire court, he declared her barren, worthless. He snapped a dead branch over her head, a cruel symbol for an empty womb, and cast her out into a raging blizzard. Stripped of her name, her home, and her honor, she was left to be swallowed by the snow, a forgotten soul collapsing at the gate of a dark and silent keep. For more stories where medieval steel defends a heart of gold, join our chronicles by subscribing and let us know which country you are watching from. The great hall of Lord Valerius was a chamber of stone and shadow, but the cold Elara felt did not come from the walls. It radiated from the eyes of the court, 100 pairs of eyes that watched her as if she were not a woman, but a cur to be judged. She stood alone on the stone floor, the warmth of the great hearth behind her failing to reach her skin. Her husband sat upon his carved oak chair, his face a mask of bored authority. He was not a man of loud rage. His cruelty was a quieter thing, sharp and precise, like a shard of ice. In his hand he held a dry, dead branch stripped of all its leaves. The silence in the hall was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Elara could feel her own heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Only an hour ago she had been the lady of this castle. Now she was a spectacle. Lord Valerius raised the branch. His voice cut through the silence, calm and clear. "For 5 years this house has waited for a son," he announced, his words echoing in the high timbered ceiling. "For 5 years we have tended to a fruitless tree, hoping for a sign of life." His gaze fell upon her, devoid of any warmth, any memory of the life they had shared. In his eyes she was merely a failed investment. "The branch remains bare," he said. "The tree is barren." A murmur went through the court. It was a sound of satisfaction, of gossip confirmed. Elara kept her eyes fixed on a tapestry hanging on the far wall, a depiction of a great hunt. She focused on the threads, on the woven figures of men and beasts, on anything but the reality of her own undoing. Valerius rose from his seat and descended the few steps to the main floor. He stopped before her, so close she could see the flicker of firelight in his polished boots. He held the branch before her face. "A wife who cannot provide an heir has no purpose in a noble house," he declared. "She is a blight, a shame to her husband's name." He did not need to shout. The quiet finality of his tone was far more devastating. With a sharp crack he snapped the brittle branch in two over her head. The pieces fell to the stone at her feet. It was done. The ritual was complete. "You are no longer wife to me," he said, turning his back on her. "You are no longer lady of this keep. You are nothing." He gestured to his guards. "Remove her." 2 armored men seized her arms. Their grip was rough, impersonal. She did not struggle. The fight had left her the moment he had spoken the word barren. A part of her had turned to ice, just as frozen as the winter landscape outside. They dragged her across the great hall, her simple shoes scraping against the stone. The heavy oak doors, which had always been opened for her with a bow, were now thrown wide to cast her out. A wall of white fury met them. The wind howled, like a starving wolf driving snow and ice into the hall. The guards flinched, but Elara felt nothing. The storm outside was no match for the one inside her. They shoved her past the threshold and into the blizzard. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the rapidly deepening snow. The cold was immediate, a physical blow that stole her breath. Behind her, the great doors boomed shut. The sound was a period at the end of her life. The warmth, the light, the world she had known, was gone. She was alone. She pushed herself to her feet, her thin woolen dress already becoming stiff with ice. The wind tore at her, pulling her hair from its pins, whipping it across her face. Snow blinded her, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world. The castle at her back disappeared within seconds. She did not know which way to go. Every direction was the same howling emptiness. Her village was a day's walk, in good weather. In this storm, it might as well be on the other side of the world. She took a step, then another. Walking was an act of pure instinct, a final fading refusal to die. But with every step the cold dug its teeth deeper into her flesh. Her feet went numb first, then her hands. The wind screamed in her ears, a merciless chorus chanting the words of her husband. Barren, worthless, nothing. The path disappeared. The trees became faint gray ghosts in the gloom. She fell, the snow cushioning her impact, but stealing what little warmth she had left. She pushed herself up, her limbs heavy as lead. She could not remember why she was walking, only that she must. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the wind, the snow, and the deepening ache in her bones. Despair, a cold and quiet certainty, began to settle in her heart. This is where it ends, she thought, a forgotten woman, buried by a forgettable storm. She stumbled again, her body too weary to rise. She lay in a drift of snow, the flakes covering her like a shroud. Her breathing grew shallow. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the cold take her, to simply stop. But as her vision blurred and the world began to fade to black, she saw something. Through the thick curtain of the blizzard, a shape, darker than the surrounding gloom. A wall. A great wall of stone, impossibly tall, crowned with the jagged shape of a turret. It was a keep, one she did not recognize. It had to be a trick of the mind, a final dream before the end. No one lived this deep in the woods, yet, as her last bit of strength failed her, and her eyes fluttered shut, she thought she saw it again. A flicker. A tiny distant point of light, like a single defiant star in a world of endless white. Inside the walls of Stonegate Keep, the storm was a distant roar, a familiar ghost that had haunted the battlements for 5 lonely winters. Lord Kalin sat in a high-backed chair, a lone sentinel in the vast, echoing darkness of his great hall. A single candelabra on the table beside him cast long, dancing shadows, making the hall seem more a tomb than a home. He had grown accustomed to the silence, to the company of dust and memory. The world outside his gates, with its petty cruelties and loud ambitions, no longer concerned him. His world was this chair, this table, and the cold stone that surrounded him. But tonight, the ghost of the storm was not alone. He heard it first as a faint scratching, a sound so small it was almost lost in the howling wind. He dismissed it. A branch, perhaps, or a loose stone. But the sound came again, a soft, desperate thud against the main gate. It was a sound of life in a place he had dedicated to death. His first instinct was irritation. An animal, most likely, a wolf seeking shelter. Let the storm have it. He had not unbarred his gates for another living soul in years, and he would not start now. He closed his eyes, willing the sound away, trying to sink back into the numb peace of his solitude. Yet the sound persisted. It was an imperfection, a yawsy, discordant note in the grim symphony of his existence. It gnawed at him, a tiny splinter, under the skin of his apathy. With a low growl of frustration, he rose. His movements were stiff, unused to any purpose beyond fetching another log for the fire or another cup of watered wine. He took a torch from its sconce, the flame casting a flickering, unsteady light as he walked the length of the hall. The great iron bolts of the gate were cold and stiff beneath his hands. They protested with a groan. Of rust and disuse. He put his shoulder to the heavy oak and pushed. The gate swung inward just enough for him to see, letting in a furious blast of wind and snow that momentarily blinded him. He saw nothing but a wall of white. The storm was a churning chaos, relentless and absolute. He was about to close the gate, his brief flicker of curiosity extinguished, when his torchlight caught something, a patch of dark color against the snowdrift piled against the gate. He lowered the torch. It was cloth, a woman's dress, dark blue, almost black against the snow. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. There, half buried, was a human form. For a long moment, Lord Kalin did nothing but stare. His mind, slow and thick from years of disuse, struggled to process the sight. His first thought was to shut the gate, to turn around, walk back to his chair, and let the snow finish its work. His peace, his hard-won emptiness, was too precious to be disturbed by the messy business of the living or the dying. But the wind shifted, peeling back a curtain of snow from the woman's face. It was pale, impossibly pale, with lips the color of a winter dusk. Her dark hair was fanned out, frozen to the ground. She was young, and in the stark, unforgiving light of his torch, she looked utterly forsaken. Something shifted within him, a feeling he had buried 5 years ago, a deep primal instinct he thought long dead. It was not pity. It was a raw, aching surge of protectiveness, a warrior's instinct to shield the defenseless. It rose from the ashes of his heart, swift and undeniable, overriding the years of practiced indifference. He did not think. He acted. He set the torch in a bracket by the gate and stepped out into the teeth of the storm. The wind tore at his tunic, but he barely felt it. He knelt, his hand sinking into the freezing snow as he carefully brushed it away from her body. She was so still. He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. When he lifted her, he was shocked by how little she weighed. She was a thing of ice and bone, a fragile bird with broken wings. Her head fell back against his shoulder, her cold cheek brushing against the rough wool of his tunic. He turned and carried her inside, into the relative quiet of the gatehouse. With a powerful kick, he swung the heavy gate shut. The iron bolt slid home with a sound of deep finality, silencing the storm's howl. The world was shut out once. More. He walked through the archway and into the great hall, his silent footsteps the only sound. The vast, empty space seemed to hold its breath. He carried her past the long, dust-covered tables, past the cold, unfeeling suits of armor that stood sentinel in the shadows. He brought her to the great hearth, a cavern of cold stone where no fire had burned in years. He gently laid her down upon a thick bearskin rug that lay before it. She did not stir. Kalen stood over her, his chest rising and falling heavily. The torchlight played across her still features, illuminating the faint blue tinge of her skin and a raw red mark on her cheek. He had brought the storm inside with him. He had brought a life, however faint, into his tomb. He looked down at the unconscious woman at his feet, and for the first time in 5 years, the suffocating silence of Stonegate Keep felt different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The first thing Elara knew was warmth. It was a strange, foreign sensation that seeped into her bones, a gentle heat that pushed back the deep, consuming cold she had accepted as her end. For a long moment she lay suspended in the darkness behind her eyes, convinced she was dreaming. Death was supposed to be cold. This gentle cocoon of warmth could not be real. The second thing she knew was the scent of wood smoke, faint but clean and sharp. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy as stones. Slowly, a blurry world swam into focus. She was staring at a ceiling of thick, dark beams. She was lying on a simple bed, not soft but firm and dry. A heavy fur blanket, smelling of pine and leather, was pulled up to her chin. Beside the bed, a small, contained fire danced in a stone hearth, its crackling the only sound in a world of profound silence. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her. Where was she? Who had brought her here? She pushed herself up on her elbows, her muscles screaming in protest. The room was small and Spartan, with stone walls and a floor of smooth, worn flagstones. A single chair and a small table were the only other furniture. On the table sat a wooden bowl, a cup, and a spoon. She looked down at herself. Her own dress, frozen and ruined, was gone. In its place she wore a simple, long-sleeved nightgown of rough but clean linen. It was far too large for her, but it was warm. Her memories returned in a rush. The great hall, the broken branch, the howling blizzard, the final crushing weight of the snow. She remembered a shape in the storm, a flicker of light. It had been real. Someone had found her. Someone had brought her here. Her throat was painfully dry. She reached a trembling hand for the cup on the table and drank the cool water. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Beside it, the bowl held a thick, steaming broth. The smell made her stomach ache with a hunger so deep it was a pain. Using the spoon, she ate slowly, the warm liquid a balm to her frozen insides. Each spoonful felt like an act of defiance against the death she had so narrowly escaped. When the bowl was empty, she lay back, her strength spent. She listened. She strained her ears for any sound, a footstep, a cough, a voice. But there was nothing, only the crackle of the fire and the sound of her own breathing. The silence was so complete, it was unnerving. It felt ancient, settled, as if the castle itself had been holding its breath for years. Over the next day, her strength began to return. Food and water appeared on the table while she slept. The firewood by the hearth was always replenished. She never saw who did it. Her savior was a ghost, a silent, invisible presence who provided for her needs without making himself known. On the third day, she felt strong enough to stand. She wrapped the heavy fur blanket around her shoulders and opened the door of her room. She peered out into a long, cold corridor, lit only by the pale gray light from a high window. The air was still and thick with the smell of dust and cold stone. There was no sign of life. Hesitantly, she stepped out. Her bare feet were silent on the flagstones. She walked the length of the corridor until it opened into the vast, cavernous space of a great hall. It was the one she had been carried into, but now, in the light of day, she could see its state of suspended decay. Long tables stood in rows, covered in a fine, undisturbed layer of dust. Suits of armor stood like steel specters along the walls, their surfaces dull. Tapestries, rich with color, were faded from years of neglect. She realized with a growing sense of awe and fear that the castle was empty. There were no servants bustling about, no guards at their posts, no ladies in waiting, no sounds from a kitchen or a smithy. It was a hollow shell, a keep inhabited only by memories, and by him. She saw him only once, a fleeting glimpse. As she stood at the edge of the great hall, she saw a tall figure pass by a distant archway, a shadow moving through the gloom. He was large, broad-shouldered, and moved with a heavy, deliberate tread. Then he was gone. He had not looked in her direction. He seemed not to have noticed her at all. This was her sanctuary, a silent, empty castle ruled by a silent, ghost-like lord. She was warm. She was fed. She was safe from the storm. For the first time since her husband had cast her out, she could breathe without fear. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. On the morning of the 5th day she awoke to a different kind of silence. The howling wind was gone. A weak, watery sunlight streamed through the narrow window of her room, painting a pale rectangle of light on the stone floor. She walked to the window and looked out. The world was blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of white. Below lay a courtyard, and beyond it a forest of snow-laden trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The sky was a pale, clear blue. The storm was over. She was no longer a wife. She was no longer a lady. She was a survivor, a guest. In a castle of ghosts. She was alive, but she had no past and no future. Her fate rested entirely in the hands of the silent man who had pulled her from the snow. A new fear, quieter but deeper than the fear of the storm, began to settle in her heart. She was safe, but she was not free. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. They were 2 ghosts haunting the same stone shell, moving in the periphery of each other's lives, their communication a silent language of gestures. Elara spent much of her time in the vast, cold library, reading of worlds she would never see. But the chill of the keep was a constant companion. One afternoon, shivering, she retreated to her room. An hour later, a sound drew her out, the unmistakable crackle of a large fire. She crept to the doorway of the great hall. Lord Callan was there, his back to her, tending to a roaring blaze in the cavernous main hearth. Flames leaped and danced, chasing the ancient cold from the stones. He had not lit it for himself. His own chair was far across the room. When the fire was burning hot and steady, he draped a heavy fur blanket over the back of a worn chair placed near the warmth. Then, without a glance in her direction, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the keep. Hesitantly, Elara approached, drawn by the heat. She sat in the chair, pulled the blanket over her, and for the first time felt the great hall was not a tomb, but a refuge. Her bare feet, soft from a life indoors, were ill-suited to the cold stone floors. She tried to repair the simple shoes she had arrived in, but the leather was frozen and torn beyond mending. The next morning, when she opened her door, a pair of boots sat on the threshold. They were not new, but were made of soft dark leather, well oiled against the damp. They had clearly belonged to someone smaller than a man. She slipped her feet into them and found they fit as if made for her. A warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the thick wool lining. He had seen her need and he had provided. Now able to venture outside, she was drawn to the one place in the keep that felt as broken as she had, the courtyard garden. It was a ruin of frozen stalks and snow-covered earth. With her bare hands she began to clear the debris, pulling at the stubborn, frozen weeds, her fingers growing raw and red in the cold. It was punishing work, but it was a purpose. From a high, narrow window in a forgotten wing of the castle, Kalin watched her. He stood back in the shadows, an unseen observer. He had not set foot in that garden since his wife had planted the white roses years ago. He had let it die with her. Now he watched this stranger, this quiet, determined woman, fighting to bring it back. He saw not foolishness, but resilience. A flicker of something that was not quite pain and not quite hope stirred in his chest. The next morning Elara found a small iron trowel and a pair of thick leather work gloves resting on the stone bench in the garden. Weeks passed. Under her patient care, the garden began to respond. Small green shoots of hardy herbs pushed through the thawing earth. The rose bushes, carefully pruned, showed signs of new life. Elara took the first clippings of thyme and rosemary and did something bold. In the keep's dusty, cavernous kitchen, she found what she needed to cook a simple, savory pottage. The aroma, rich and warm, filled the silent halls, a scent of life in a place of slumbering grief. She left a steaming bowl on the massive table where he took his solitary meals of bread and cheese. She retreated, her heart pounding with uncertainty. An hour later, she returned to find the bowl empty. She did this every evening, and every evening the bowl was left empty. It was the only conversation they had. In her quiet explorations, Elara discovered a wing of the keep that was different from the rest. The dust here was thicker, the air heavier with a palpable sorrow. The end of the hall stood a single, heavy door, firmly locked. A feeling of profound grief emanated from it, and she knew, with an instinct she could not explain, that this was the heart of his pain. She respected its boundary, never touching the handle, but she could not leave the sorrow to gather dust. One afternoon she brought buckets of water and soft rags. Quietly, meticulously, she cleaned the hallway leading to the door. She washed the floors, polished the wood of a small side table, and wiped the grime from a sconce. She was not erasing the past, but honoring it. When she was done, she went to the garden and clipped the first white rose that had bloomed, a perfect, solitary flower. She placed it in a cup of water on the polished table, a silent offering to the memory behind the door. That night Kalin walked his customary lonely path through the keep. He turned into the west wing and stopped dead. The air was different, clean. The floor beneath his boots shone faintly in the moonlight. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, fell upon the small table beside the locked door. He saw the rose, a single perfect white rose glowing like a pearl in the darkness. He took a hesitant step closer. He knew that rose bush. His wife had called it her winter star. He reached out a large, calloused hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently, so gently, touching the edge of a velvety petal. A tremor went through him. For 5 years he had built a wall of stone and silence around his heart, and this small, quiet woman, with a single silent gesture, had just found a crack. The white rose was a ghost of a memory he had tried to bury. As Lord Callan stood in the silent, moonlit corridor, the touch of the soft petal beneath his finger was a key, unlocking a door in his mind that he had sworn to keep sealed forever. The narrator's voice would tell the story he could not. 5 years ago this hall had not been silent. It had echoed with a quiet joy, with the soft laughter of his wife, Lyra. She was the heart of Stonegate Keep, a woman whose spirit was as bright and gentle as the white roses she loved to plant in the garden. For years they had prayed for a child, an heir to fill the halls with a new generation of life. When Lyra finally quickened with child, a fragile hope bloomed in Callan's heart. He, a man forged in battle and accustomed to the harsh realities of lordship, found himself softened by the promise of fatherhood. He would sit with his wife for hours in the garden, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand gently placed on the swell of her belly, feeling the faint fluttering promise of the life within. The day their son was born, the keep was filled with a nervous energy. Callan paced the halls outside his wife's chambers, his warrior's calm completely undone. Then he heard it, the thin, reedy cry of a newborn. A fierce protective joy seized him, so powerful it brought him to his knees. He had a son, but joy, he learned that day, was a fleeting and cruel thing. It was a flicker of a candle in a gale. The midwife's triumphant smile quickly faded. A sudden complication, a whisper of fear, then a frantic rush. The healthy cry of his son was soon lost in a rising tide of panic. Callan was helpless, a giant of a man made powerless by a battle he could not fight. By dusk, the battle was over. The silence that fell upon the chambers was an unnatural thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket where there should have been the sounds of a new mother and her child. He had lost them both, his son, who had lived for less than an hour, and his wife, whose light had been extinguished forever. Callan's grief was not a storm. It was a cataclysm. It leveled the entire landscape of his soul, leaving nothing behind but rubble and ash. The bustling life of his keep, once a source of pride, became a torment. The sympathetic glances of his servants were like daggers, the sound of a kitchen maid humming, the sight of a stable boy playing with a puppy. Every small, ordinary sign of life was a mocking reminder of the cradle that would forever remain empty. A week after he had buried them, he walked into his wife's chambers for the last time. Everything was as she had left it. The scent of dried lavender still hung in the air. A piece of weaving was still on her loom, the threads waiting for a hand that would never return. He stood before the empty cradle he had carved himself, a single perfect tear tracing a path through the dust on its surface. He walked out, closed the heavy oak door, and turned the iron key in the lock. The sound of the tumblers falling into place was the sound of his heart closing forever. That day, he summoned his entire staff. He paid them all a lifetime of wages, thanked them for their service, and ordered them to leave. He could not bear the pulse of life within his walls. He chose the honest silence of ghosts over the painful pity of the living. For 5 years he had been the sole occupant of his own tomb, and now this rose, this single white flower left by a woman who knew nothing of his story, yet seemed to understand its sorrow. As he stood there, the memory faded, leaving a raw, aching clarity in its wake. He finally understood the impulse that had driven him into the storm to rescue a half-frozen stranger. When he had looked down at Elara's face, he had not seen a mere outcast. He had seen a fellow survivor, a woman condemned by fate, cast out for a perceived failure of the womb, the very thing that had shattered his own world. He had saved her from the cruelty of men, but her quiet, resilient presence was something more. Her small acts of life, tending the dead garden, filling the hall with the scent of cooking, honoring a grief she could not possibly understand, were a challenge to the death he had wrapped himself in. Callan finally pulled his hand back from the rose. He had pulled her from the snow to protect her from the world. Now a terrifying question arose in the ruins of his heart. Had he, in doing so, brought the one person into his keep who could save him from himself? The fragile peace of Stonegate Keep was not destined to last. While Elara and Callan were forging a silent bond in their shared solitude, the world they had shut out was stirring. Miles away, in a hall filled with warmth and sycophantic laughter, Lord Valerius was celebrating his new betrothal. His intended bride was young, her father a man of immense wealth and political influence. The alliance would secure Valerius's position for decades. During the feast, a hunter, hoping for a reward, knelt before him. He spoke of strange signs of life at the abandoned Stonegate Keep, of smoke rising from its chimneys. Then, as an afterthought, he mentioned seeing a woman in the keep's garden. A woman, he said, who bore a striking resemblance to the Lady Elara. A chill descended upon Valerius's table. His fiancée's father raised a questioning eyebrow. The marriage contract was clear. Elara was to be considered legally dead or be sent to the Silent Sisters, a convent from which no one ever returned. Her continued existence, free and under the protection of a neighboring lord, was an unacceptable complication. It was an insult to Valerius's authority and a stain on his honor. Valerius's smile was thin and cruel. He was not a man who tolerated loose ends. He saw Elara not as a person, but as a piece of property that had wandered off. He would retrieve it, dispose of it properly, and finalize his brilliant new alliance. 2 days later, the quiet of Stonegate was broken. Elara was in the garden tending to the white rose bush when she heard it. A faint rhythmic drumming, a sound so foreign to the keep that it took her a moment to place it. Horses, many of them, moving at a steady, determined pace. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Callan heard it too. He was in the armory, running an oiled cloth over a long, neglected sword, habit he had resumed without knowing why. He dropped the blade with a clang and ascended the winding stairs to the battlements. From the high wall he saw them, a column of a dozen riders, their armor glinting in the midday sun. At their head flew a banner he knew all too well, the snarling black wolf of Lord Valerius. A cold, familiar rage settled over Callan. The instinct of the warrior, dormant for 5 years, awoke with a vengeance. The world had come knocking at his gate, and it had come for her. Elara had followed him to the main courtyard, her face pale. She saw the look in his eyes as he descended from the wall, and she knew. Her past had found her. The sanctuary was about to be breached. The old fear, the feeling of being small and helpless, threatened to swallow her whole. Callan saw the terror on her face. He stopped before her, and for the first time his presence was not distant or ghostly. It was solid, a shield. He gave her a single, sharp nod, a silent command to stay back. Then he turned and walked to the main gate, his steps heavy and resolute. The riders drew up before the gate, their horses snorting and stamping in the snow. Lord Valerius, resplendent in polished steel and a fine fur cloak, dismounted. He strode to the gate and slammed his gauntleted fist against the ancient wood. The sound was a brutal violation of the keep's long silence. "Open this gate," Valerius boomed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Open in the name of Lord Valerius." There was no answer. "Do you hear me, Callan?" he shouted, his patience already wearing thin. "I know you are in there. I have come to collect my property." Still silence. Valerius was about to order his men to bring up a ram when a loud crack echoed from the gate. The small iron-banded Judas gate, a door within the door, creaked open. Lord Callan filled the opening. He was not wearing armor, only his simple tunic and leather breeches. But his sheer size and the cold, unyielding stillness of his posture made him seem more formidable than any armored knight. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a mountain of silent refusal. Valerius sneered, regaining his composure. "So the hermit emerges. I am told you are harboring my wife, a woman I cast out for her barrenness. She is my legal property to dispose of as I see fit. Hand her over, and I will forget this trespass." Callan's eyes, gray and hard as granite, were fixed on Valerius. The air crackled with a tension thicker than the Winter cold. The fragile peace had been shattered. A war had just been declared on the threshold of his home. Lord Kaelin's silence was his answer. He did not move, did not speak. He simply held Lord Valerius's gaze, an immovable object of silent defiance. Valerius's sneer tightened. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, and this silent refusal was more infuriating than any shouted insult. "Do not test me, Kaelin," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. He gestured to his guards, who shifted, their hands moving to the hilts of their swords. "I will not be denied. That woman is a loose end I intend to tie. Step aside, or we will tear this rotting gate from its hinges." From the courtyard, Elara watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide in the shadows of the keep, as she had hidden from life for so long. She saw the steel in the hands of Valerius's men, and the cold fury in Kaelin's eyes. This man, this silent stranger, was willing to face down armed soldiers for her. For her, the woman her husband had named nothing. And in that moment, something shifted within her. The shame Valerius had branded her with began to burn away, replaced by a slow, rising fire of indignation. She had endured his cruelty in silence. She had accepted his judgment and allowed it to define her. She had nearly died under the weight of his lie. No more. With her back straight and her head held high, Elara walked forward. She moved, past the suits of armor, across the snow-dusted courtyard, until she stood just behind Kaelin in the opening of the gate. Valerius's eyes widened in triumph when he saw her. "Ah," he gloated, "the stray comes when called. Your loyalty is commendable, if misplaced. Come, Elara, your foolish game is over." "I am not a stray," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the cold, still air with perfect clarity. It did not tremble. "And I am not yours." Valerius laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My dear, you are whatever I say you are. You are my wife. A barren wife, true, but mine by law and by God." "The law is built upon truth, my lord," Elara said, her gaze as steady as Kaelin's. "And you know nothing of truth." She took a single step forward, standing beside Kaelin, no longer shielded by him but standing with him. She looked directly at her former husband, at the man who had discarded her like trash. "You have ridden across the land," she said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "telling every lord and lady of my great failure, of my empty womb. You made my shame your shield, but I will not carry it for you any longer." "What is this nonsense?" Valerius blustered, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "It is the truth," Elara stated plainly, "a truth your own physician confessed to me, with tears in his eyes, begging me to keep his secret, lest you have him killed. The fault was never mine, Valerius. The branch that will not bear fruit is your own." A deathly silence fell over the clearing. The wind died down. The horses stood still. Valerius's men stared first at Elara, then at their lord. The accusation hung in the air, heavier than any sword. To be sterile for a nobleman whose entire purpose was to continue his line was the ultimate humiliation. Valerius's face, which had been a mask of arrogant triumph, crumbled. It passed through shades of shock, to white-hot rage, to the deep mottled red of utter shame. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The lie he had built his future on had just been torn down in front of his own men. Kaelin had not moved a muscle. Now, with a slow, deliberate motion, he drew the long sword that had been tucked in his belt. He did not raise it in a challenge. He simply held it, the point resting lightly on the stone before him. The gesture was not a threat of attack. It was a statement. It was a border being drawn. The conversation was over. The sight of the steel, combined with the ruin of his pride, broke Valerius completely. He sputtered an incoherent curse, his authority shattered. He could see the doubt and pity in the eyes of his own guards. Defeated, he turned without another word, scrambled onto his horse with clumsy haste, and spurred the animal into a frantic retreat. His men, after a moment of confused hesitation, turned and followed, a disordered and shamed procession. They were gone. The thunder of their hooves faded, and silence once again descended upon Stonegate Keep. Galen slowly sheathed his sword, the metallic slide loud in the stillness. He turned to Elara. The air between them was different, charged with the aftermath of the battle they had won together. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw not the fragile victim he had rescued from the snow, but the woman who had faced down her tyrant and felled him with the truth. A deep, unspoken respect shone in his eyes. The victory did not bring cheers or celebration. It left behind a profound and ringing silence. The threat had passed, leaving Elara and Galen standing in the gatehouse, two solitary figures in the vast, quiet keep. The unspoken had been said, the tyrant had been vanquished, and now a new, uncertain peace settled between them. They parted without a word. Elara retreated to the garden, the place of her own making, needing the feel of soil and life beneath her fingers. Galen disappeared into the depths of the keep, to the armory where he had first felt the call to battle again. They spent the afternoon apart, each processing the seismic shift that had just occurred. The roles of protector and protected had fallen away, leaving them as simply a man and a woman who had stood together. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, Galen sought her out. He moved with a purpose he had not felt in years, a quiet certainty guiding his steps. He knew where he would find her. She was standing by the white rosebush, its blossoms like pale stars in the fading light. Her back was to him, her posture calm and still. She was not the frightened woman he had found in the snow, nor the fierce queen who had faced down her tormentor. She was simply Elara, a woman at peace in a garden she had reclaimed from death. His footsteps were soft on the damp earth, but she heard him. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable, but for the lack of fear in her eyes. She did not startle. She simply watched him approach as if she had been waiting. He stopped before her, the space between them charged with everything that had not been said. The dying light softened the hard lines of his face, revealing the weariness and the sorrow that he always carried. He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all its usual guards. He saw the woman who had honored his grief before she even knew its name. Slowly, Galen reached into the rough-spun fabric of his tunic. He drew out his hand, and in his palm lay a heavy, ornate iron key, dark with age. It was not the key to the keep, nor to the armory, nor to the treasury. It was a key Elara had never seen, yet she knew instinctively what it was. It was the key to the locked door, the key to the heart of his sorrow. He extended his hand, offering it to her. His arm was steady, but in his eyes she saw a universe of vulnerability. It was not a demand or a request. It was an offering. He was giving her his pain, his past, the ghost of his lost love, and the memory of his son. He was trusting her with the most broken parts of himself. Elara's gaze moved from the key in his palm to the deep sorrow in his eyes. Her heart ached with a profound empathy, not of pity, but of understanding. She knew what it was to be defined by a loss. She did not hesitate. She slowly raised her hand, her fingers cool and gentle, as she took the heavy key from him. Its weight felt sacred in her palm. As her fingers closed around it, she did not pull her hand away. Instead, she covered his large, calloused hand with her own, her warmth seeping into his skin. His breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. They stood there for a long time as the last light bled from the sky and the first stars pricked the darkness. Her hand covering his, the key, a cold, heavy promise, held safely between them. No words were spoken. In the shared silence of the garden, a vow was made. A vow to guard a broken past and to build a new future together. The silence of Stonegate Keep was finally filled, not with ghosts, but with a quiet, resilient hope. The story of Lord Valerius's humiliation spread through the lands like wildfire. A man's pride and lineage were the cornerstones of his power, and Valerius had been exposed as having neither. His wealthy betrothed broke their contract, her father refusing to ally with a house built on such a pathetic lie. Mocked in whispers and scorned by his peers, his influence withered. He became a recluse in his own keep, a prisoner of the same silence he had tried to condemn Elara to, his name a bitter lesson in the fragility of cruel pride. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the scars on the land and on the heart began to heal. The great gates of Stonegate Keep, once barred and bolted against the world, now stood open. Life had returned to its stone halls, not with the bustle of a full court, but with a quiet, steady pulse. The dust was gone, the tapestries were clean, and the air no longer felt heavy with the house. Ghosts of the past. Sunlight streamed through polished windows, illuminating rooms that had been dark for 5 years. Elara had used the key. Together, she and Kaelin had opened the locked door. They did not erase the memory of Lyra and her child. Instead, they honored it. The room was no longer a sealed tomb, but a quiet place of remembrance, its shutters open to let in the air and the scent of the garden. The past was not forgotten, but was woven into the fabric of the present, a thread of sorrow that made the new tapestry of their lives all the richer. This new life was most apparent in the garden. What had been a frozen ruin was now a riot of color and fragrance. Herbs grew thick and green, and the white rose bush was covered in blossoms. And in the middle of it all, 2 small figures darted in and out of the flower beds, their laughter the sweetest sound the keep had ever known. They were a boy and a girl, orphans from a nearby village that had suffered a fire. They had arrived at the keep's newly opened gates, hungry and afraid, and Kaelin and Elara had taken them in without hesitation. They had his dark, thoughtful eyes and her quiet, resilient smile. They were not children of blood, but children of the heart, and they had filled the silent castle with a joy more profound than any air could have. Elara and Kaelin sat together on the stone bench, the same bench where he had once left her a pair of gardening gloves. The late afternoon sun warmed their faces. He was no longer the grim ghost of Stonegate, and she was no longer the barren wife. They were the lord and lady of a home that was finally, truly alive. The little boy, chasing his sister, stumbled and fell into a patch of soft grass near the rose bush. He looked up, his face smeared with dirt, and let out a peal of delighted laughter. Elara smiled, a gentle, radiant expression of pure contentment. Kaelin looked at her, at the woman who had brought life back not only to his home, but to his very soul. He reached over and placed his large, warm hand over hers, his fingers lacing through hers in a gesture of simple, profound belonging. Together, they watched the children play amongst the white roses as the sun dipped below the rolling hills, painting the sky in strokes of gold and fire. The silence that settled around them was not one of loneliness or grief, but of a deep and lasting peace. They were home,